We are now in Buenos Aires with Fernando Ras. He's a former diplomat, but actually in Japan, perhaps he found a different calling.
The reason why I chose Meiji architecture and as a subject for this series is number one, because I've always been interested in architecture. And number two, I wanted to find something in Japanese architecture that was not a frequent subject of Japanese photography. And there are tons of work on Japanese traditional architecture, some of it magnificently beautiful, and there are other tons of work on modern Japanese architecture, which deserves every picture it gets. It's magnificent. But there's very little in between the Meiji architecture and post-World War II architecture. There's very little photography. So that was one of the reasons why I went into I took up Meiji architecture. The early stages of the architecture that came at the same time as the Meiji Revolution, which was called Meiji architecture, is externally Western looking, but internally the construction systems are basically traditional Japanese construction construction techniques. The outside of the architecture was Western looking, but the inside, they started experimenting with cement, with steel, with other Western methods of construction, until you finally come to the crowning point of Meiji architecture, which is, we will see it later, Akasaka Guest House, which both internally and externally is complete Western building that happens to be placed in Japan.
So we could say that as it's characteristic of the Japanese ingenuity, they did all they could to master the techniques and the architectural, let's say, lessons and sense from the West in order to prove that they were not only capable, but perhaps could be even better at it. In any case, you are going to tell us about that.
For myriad of reasons, the leadership of the country decided to adopt Western techniques and the Western thought and Western priorities, preserving their traditional values. And this is what you get in Japanese Meiji architecture. This here is an interesting piece, not only from a photographic point of view, but from the fact that it is at the very, very heart of downtown Tokyo. Beautifully preserved. Here there are some boards missing, but have since been repaired. And it's an example of German architecture translated entirely to Tokyo. Today it operates as the park ranger's office for that area of downtown parks.
That's interesting because it also then reflects in a humbler way the strong German influence that was evident during the end of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century in Japan.
Yes, but this comes even before that. It's in the 1870s, 1880s. This is the other extreme of the other end of Meiji architecture. This is Akasaka Imperial Guest House. It is the most finished product of Meiji architecture. It is not only from the outside that the Japanese architects have mastered magnificently Western architecture. It is structurally the inside of the buildings, how the materials that were involved, the incorporation of Western techniques, the use of steel, the use of other flooring and material for the walls and the ceilings. It is a complete Western building, which by chance happens to be in downtown Tokyo. So this is interesting. But somehow the spirit of Japan is retained here by the presence of these trees. which in no Western building would you have that kind of landscaping around a Western, around an 18th century, a 19th century
yes, that makes it
construction.
really unique and interesting.
Yes.
You're right. And let's go on to some interiors. Are they a fusion between East and West?
No, this is absolutely Western. Mhm. This is interesting. This today is one of the Toyota's guest houses in downtown Tokyo. What's interesting about it is that the public part of the house was completely Western, inside and out, like you see here. Everything was completely Western. The wallpapering, the flooring, everything.
What's the period?
This again is late 19th, very early 20th century. But the residential part of this building was completely Japanese.
I see. So it's not a fusion, but it's like two separate worlds.
Exactly. One was the public world where you were expected to reflect public policy, and that's how you lived. And the other world was the private world, which was conducted in a traditional manner.
Yeah, we could say that this sort of dichotomy, it's in a way very much preferred or used by the Japanese, even in the different areas of their lives until today.
Yes, even today you find that to a certain extent. This, on the other hand, is the Japan Central Bank. This, from a start, was meant to be completely Western looking and Western functionally. Here you were expected not to adapt only the forms of being Western, but also the way of thinking and operating of a central bank in the West. So this is a completely different a completely different stage of the development of Meiji architecture.
And we could say even of the development of the Japanese mind, as somehow the architecture, the building, and its function impacted their behavior.
Absolutely. Here, I have 2 or 3 photographs taken outside of Tokyo, because it's interesting to see how in different areas of Japan, for example, the southern coast of Honshu Island, which is much warmer than Tokyo is, the architecture adapted, and it did not take into account so much German or English influence, but Southern French, Italian influence in the architecture, so that the end product was adapted to the circumstances where the building was put up.
So that really reveals a keen, like the Japanese are always very keen at observing and at researching, and they knew how to change from north to south when required.
Absolutely. From north to south, and they're very keen on nature and the relationship between, which is one of the magnificent characteristics of their native architecture, that fusion between what goes on in nature and what goes inside the house. This is somehow reflected in this type of adoption of Western architecture from warmer climates or from colder climates, and adapted to different circumstances or functions. This here again is an interior. It's an interior of the previous house, of the previous building, and you see that this is that has incorporated a strong influence of Art Nouveau architecture and decoration.
We will say more Macintosh-like.
Yes, more Macintosh-like.
English Art Nouveau.
Yes, exactly. Which has nothing to do perhaps with the outside, which is very Italianate in its outlook, and it's definitely not Art Nouveau. But the inside is Art Nouveau. That eclecticism is one of the characteristics of the adoption of Western architecture by the Meiji construction.
Here we can see some of it, right?
This is a house built in Kyoto by the gentleman who was then Japan's tobacco king.
Very
So
interesting.
it's very interesting. Today it works by his great-great-great-granddaughter as a tea house. So all the reception rooms downstairs have been turned into tea parlors. The middle, the story in between are reception rooms that are used for private functions. And what is interesting is that on the third floor, under the roof, you have some beautiful, beautiful Japanese rooms, perfectly Japanese rooms.
So never too far from their own indigenous
And
culture,
it's interesting.
regardless.
It's interesting to see that his parents and his wife's parents lived out upstairs in the Japanese room. His family lived in the first floor, the intermediate room, and the public functions of the house were on the ground floor. Very, very interesting.
Right, very interesting.
And it was perfectly regimented. Here you have another, this is Tokyo again. It's in an area of Tokyo where there's a lot of traffic and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's a beautiful imitation not only of Greek revival but of original Greek building, but with many details which have been adopted. This is very late Meiji, which remind you that this is Japan, that it is not Greece. You have here the 16-petal Japanese
Chrysanthemum, the imperial.
And here you have a reference to the Japanese Empire.
The Kiku
And
no
here
Mon.
in between, you have Japanese symbols. Overall, the construction, you look at it and it looks Greek. You have to look at it carefully to understand that this is a Japanese interpretation of Greek architecture.
Yeah, in that way we could say it's a small and rather rare masterpiece.
It's absolutely charming, and technically it is perfect. It is really perfect. This is what we're getting towards the end of Meiji. This isn't actually, this is not even very Meiji. This is built in the 1920s by a very powerful, very wealthy man, where the feeling of Japan has nothing to do with the architecture. The architecture is perfectly Western, absolutely Western. But you have the little details here, the porcelain, the divans, some other details here and there, which remind you that you are in Japan. But the structure itself, the thought pattern and the use of the building has become completely Japanese.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and we enjoy very much talking to you.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you.